I never expected the truth to come out the way it did. Not on a quiet Thursday afternoon, not while she stood in the cold hallway of the courthouse, and definitely not when her knees buckled beneath her as she signed the final divorce papers. They said it was stress. They said it was heartbreak. But the moment she opened her eyes in the hospital, nothing made sense anymore. A tall man in an expensive suit rushed into the hospital room. He pushed past nurses who tried to stop him. "Sir, only family can enter," they said. He didn't even pause. "Move. That's my wife." And what happened next shattered her ex-husband's world. Who was this man who called her my wife? Why did he rush in, as if he'd been searching for her for years? And why did her ex-husband suddenly go pale when he saw him? What secret connected these three lives? And how could one moment, one collapse, unravel a story buried for decades? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Grace, 58 years old, with soft hazel eyes that once sparkled with dreams but had grown dim over the years. She wasn't the kind of woman who demanded attention when she walked into a room. She was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of person who listened more than she spoke. People often overlooked her, and perhaps that's why she became so easy to take for granted. Grace had married young, 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in literature and a notebook full of stories she wanted to tell the world. She met Richard at a friend's wedding, a man 7 years her senior who worked in insurance sales. He was confident, charming, the kind of man who made promises easily. He told her she was beautiful, that he'd support her dreams, that they'd build a life together where she could write while he provided stability. She believed him. She believed every word. The first few years were good. They weren't perfect, but they were good enough. Richard worked long hours, and Grace started writing her novel at the kitchen table while dinner simmered on the stove. She'd read him passages sometimes, her voice filled with excitement, and he'd nod absently while watching television. "That's nice, honey," he'd say. "Keep at it." But as the years passed, his interest faded completely. Her dreams became background noise in their marriage, something he tolerated rather than celebrated. Grace told herself it was normal, that marriages required sacrifice, that love meant putting someone else's needs before your own. So she set aside her manuscript. She took a part-time job at the local library to help with bills. She kept their home immaculate, prepared his favorite meals, attended his company events with a smile plastered on her face, even when his colleagues barely acknowledged her presence. 35 years. That's how long she gave to a man who stopped seeing her somewhere around year 10. Richard became distant, irritable, always finding fault in small things. The house wasn't clean enough. Dinner was too bland. She talked too much, or not enough, depending on his mood. Grace learned to make herself smaller, quieter, less of a burden. She stopped mentioning her old dream of writing. She stopped asking him about his day when it became clear he found her questions annoying. She existed in the margins of her own life, a supporting character in someone else's story. And the tragedy was that she didn't even realize how much of herself she'd lost until the day Richard came home and told her he wanted a divorce. It was a Tuesday evening in late September. The air had that crisp quality that comes just before autumn fully settles in. Grace had made pot roast, his favorite, and set the table with care. She'd even picked up a bottle of wine, thinking maybe they could talk, really talk, the way they used to when they were young. Richard walked in at 6:15, his tie loosened, his face unreadable. He didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, briefcase still in hand, and said the words that would shatter the fragile world she'd built around their marriage. "I want a divorce, Grace. I've already spoken to a lawyer. The papers will be ready next week." She stared at him, the serving spoon still in her hand, steam rising from the pot roast. "What?" It came out as barely a whisper. Richard sighed like she was being difficult. "I'm not happy. I haven't been happy for years. I need to live my life before it's too late. You'll be fine. You're a capable woman. Capable. That word echoed in her mind for days afterward. Not cherished, not loved, capable, as if their entire marriage had been a business arrangement, and he was simply terminating a contract that no longer served him. Grace didn't fight it. What would be the point? You can't force someone to love you. And she was too tired, too hollowed out, to beg. She signed the papers when they arrived. She agreed to his terms, which were surprisingly generous only because he felt guilty. She later realized. Guilty because there was someone else. His secretary, naturally. A woman named Jennifer, 15 years younger, with bright eyes and ambition and all the energy Grace no longer possessed. Richard didn't tell her directly. She found out from a neighbor who'd seen them together at a restaurant 2 towns over. The humiliation was almost worse than the heartbreak. How many people knew? How long had it been going on? Had she been the last to know? The foolish wife who couldn't see what was right in front of her. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning in late October. The courthouse was cold, sterile, smelling faintly of floor cleaner and old paper. Grace wore a navy blue dress, her best one, though she wasn't sure why she'd bothered. Richard arrived with his lawyer, barely making eye contact with her. The whole process took less than an hour. Signatures, stamps, a judge who looked bored, who'd probably handled a dozen cases just like theirs that week. When it was over, Grace walked out into the hallway, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. She felt strange, unmoored, like she was floating outside her own body. The hallway stretched before her, too bright, too loud with echoing footsteps and distant conversations. Her chest tightened, her vision blurred at the edges. She tried to take a breath but couldn't seem to fill her lungs. And then her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor, papers scattering around her, and the last thing she remembered was the sound of her wedding ring rolling away from her, a tiny metallic ping that seemed to echo forever. When Grace opened her eyes, everything was white. White ceiling tiles with fluorescent lights, white walls, white sheets pulled up to her chest. The smell of antiseptic filled her nose. She tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, uncooperative. A heart monitor beeped steadily beside her. An IV drip hung from a metal stand, the line running into her left arm. Where was she? What had happened? Her mind felt foggy, thoughts moving through molasses. The courthouse, the papers, the feeling of everything collapsing inward. She'd fainted. They must have brought her to the hospital. How embarrassing. She tried to reach for the call button, but before she could, she heard voices outside her room. One was a nurse, professional and firm. The other was a man's voice, deep and urgent, unfamiliar. "Sir, I'm sorry, but only immediate family members are allowed in the ICU at this time. You'll need to wait in the general waiting area until the doctor clears visitors." The man's response was immediate, almost desperate. "You don't understand. I need to see her. Please. That's my wife in there." Grace's heart stuttered. "My wife? That couldn't be right. Richard wouldn't call her that, wouldn't sound so concerned." They were divorced now. The door to her room swung open before the nurse could respond further, and a man strode in with the kind of presence that made everything else in the room seem to shrink. He was tall, easily 6'2", with silver-streaked dark hair and a face that carried both strength and gentleness. He wore an expensive charcoal suit, the kind you saw in magazines, and his eyes, deep brown and intense, locked onto Grace with an emotion she couldn't quite place. Relief? Fear? Something else entirely? The nurse hurried in behind him, flustered. "Sir, you can't just barge in here. We have protocols. Security will be called if you don't leave immediately." The man didn't even glance at her. He moved to Grace's bedside, his movements careful, controlled, as if he was afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. His hand reached out, hovering just above hers, and when he finally touched her fingers, his hand was warm and steady. "Grace," he said softly, and the way he said her name, with such familiarity, such tenderness, made her breath catch. "Can you hear me? You're safe now. I'm here." Grace stared at him, her mind racing. She'd never seen this man before in her life. She was certain of it. She would have remembered him. Everything about him was memorable, from the way he carried himself to the intensity in his eyes. "Who are you?" Her voice came out rough, scratchy from dehydration. The man's expression shifted, something like pain crossing his features. "You don't remember?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I suppose that makes sense. It's been so long, but I never forgot. Not for a single day." Before Grace could respond, before she could demand answers, another commotion erupted in the hallway. Richard's voice, loud and indignant, cut through the quiet of the ICU. "What do you mean I can't see her? I'm her husband. We've been married for 35 years. Let me through." The irony of him calling himself her husband mere hours after their divorce was finalized wasn't lost on Grace, but she was too disoriented to process it. Richard burst into the room, his face red with frustration, his lawyer trailing behind him looking uncomfortable. He stopped short when he saw the man standing by Grace's bedside. For a long moment, neither man moved. The tension in the room became suffocating. Richard's eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed in confusion. "Wait. I know you. You're William Cross, the tech entrepreneur. I've seen you in Forbes. What the hell are you doing in my wife's hospital room?" William Cross. The name meant nothing to Grace, but clearly it meant something to Richard. William didn't acknowledge Richard's question. He simply placed himself between Richard and the hospital bed, his posture protective. "Your ex-wife," he corrected coolly. "The divorce was finalized this morning. You have no legal right to be here making demands. Grace's well-being is my concern now." Richard sputtered, his face turning an even deeper shade of red. "Your concern? You don't even know her. I've been married to her for over 3 decades. Who do you think you are?" William's expression remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Someone who values her. Someone who sees her worth. Someone who's been waiting a very long time for the chance to make sure she's never overlooked again." The words hung in the air, cryptic and weighted with meaning. Grace couldn't begin to understand. A doctor entered then, breaking the standoff, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an air of authority. "Gentlemen, this is a hospital room, not a conference hall. My patient needs rest, not drama. Everyone except immediate family needs to leave. Now." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the doctor held up a hand. "And, before you start, sir, I've been informed that you and the patient finalized your divorce this morning. That means you're no longer considered next of kin. Mr. Cross here provided documentation showing he's listed as her medical proxy and emergency contact." Richard looked like he'd been slapped. "That's impossible. There must be some mistake. How could he be listed as anything? She doesn't even know him." But even as Richard protested, something was shifting in Grace's memory. A tug at the edges of her consciousness. Something about William's face, the way he'd said her name, felt distantly familiar in a way she couldn't quite grasp, like a dream she'd almost forgotten upon waking. The doctor ushered Richard and his lawyer out despite their protests. William remained, and the doctor gave him a measured look. "You have 10 minutes, Mr. Cross. She needs rest, and we need to run more tests." He nodded gratefully. "Thank you, doctor. That's all I need." When they were alone, Grace finally found her voice again. "Who are you? Really? And why are you claiming to be my emergency contact? How is any of this possible?" William pulled a chair close to her bedside and sat down slowly, as if giving her time to tell him to leave. He studied her face for a long moment, and Grace could see so many emotions flickering across his features. Sadness, hope, regret, determination. "You really don't remember me, do you? It's been 38 years, so I suppose that's not surprising. We only met once, and it was brief. But that meeting, Grace, that single conversation changed the entire course of my life." Grace's head was spinning. 38 years ago? She would have been barely 20, still in college, still dreaming of becoming a writer, still years away from meeting Richard. "I don't understand." William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, weathered, a photograph, creased and faded with age. He held it out to her. Grace took it with trembling fingers. The photo showed a young woman, probably around 19 or 20, sitting on a bench outside what looked like a library. She had long dark hair, longer than Grace had worn it in decades, and she was smiling at something off camera. She was holding a notebook, pen in hand. Grace's breath caught. That was her. She recognized the bench, the library at her college. She even remembered that notebook, the one she'd filled with story ideas and character sketches. But she had no memory of anyone taking this photograph. "Where did you get this?" Her voice shook. William's expression softened. "I took it. May of 1986. You were sitting outside the library, completely absorbed in whatever you were writing. I was a graduate student, just finished with finals, about to start what I thought would be a miserable summer internship at my father's company. I felt trapped, suffocated by expectations, convinced I'd never find my own path. And then I saw you." Grace stared at the photograph, then back at William, searching her memory. "I don't remember. I'm sorry. I don't remember meeting you at all." He nodded, as if he'd expected this. "I almost walked past you. But something made me stop. Maybe it was the intensity on your face, the way you were so completely present in what you were doing." I asked what you were writing. "Do you know what you told me?" Grace shook her head mutely. "You said you were working on a story about second chances, about people who meet at the wrong time in their lives and then find each other again when they're finally ready. You told me that everyone has a purpose, but sometimes it takes a lifetime to discover what it is. You said the best stories aren't about people who have it all figured out. They're about people who keep searching even when the path isn't clear." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes. She had no specific memory of this conversation, but those words, those beliefs, they sounded exactly like something her younger self would have said. "That's what I believed back then, before life taught me differently." William leaned forward slightly. "You asked me what I wanted to do with my life. No one had ever asked me that before. Everyone told me what I should do, what was expected, what made sense, but you asked what I wanted, and I told you the truth. I wanted to build something that mattered. I wanted to create technology that could help people connect, that could make the world feel smaller and more accessible. I wanted to matter, not because of my family's name, but because of what I could contribute. And do you know what you said?" Grace shook her head again, transfixed. "You looked right at me and said, 'Then do that. Don't let anyone convince you to live a life that isn't yours. The world needs people who care enough to build something meaningful.'" William's voice grew thick with emotion. "I went home that night and quit my father's company. He didn't speak to me for 2 years. I started my first tech company in my apartment with borrowed money and a business partner I met at a coffee shop. We failed, spectacularly, lost everything, but I remembered what you said. I kept going. Second company did better. Third one changed everything. We developed software for educational platforms, making learning accessible to underserved communities globally. Everything I built, every decision I made, I did it asking myself, would this matter? Would this make a difference? Because that's what you taught me in a 15-minute conversation outside a library. You changed my entire life, Grace, and you don't even remember it." Grace felt tears spilling down her cheeks now. "Even if that's true, even if we met that day, it doesn't explain why you're here now, why you've been listed as my emergency contact, how you even knew where I was." William took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "After that day, I tried to find you again. I went back to that library bench every afternoon for weeks, but I never saw you there. I didn't know your last name. I only knew your first name because I'd heard someone call to you as you were leaving that day. Years passed. I built my companies. I got married, had a daughter, got divorced. I tried to move on with my life. But I never forgot you. About 10 years ago, I hired a private investigator. I know how that sounds, but I needed to know if you'd achieved your dreams, if you'd become the writer you wanted to be. When he found you, when he told me you'd set aside your writing, that you'd been married for decades to someone who didn't seem to value you, something broke inside me. But you were married. You'd made vows. I had no right to interfere. So I didn't. I made sure you were okay." From a distance, Grace didn't know whether to be touched or disturbed. "You've been watching me for 10 years?" William shook his head quickly. "Not watching. Just ensuring you were safe. I set up a trust that paid your medical bills when you had that surgery 3 years ago. Did you wonder why your insurance suddenly covered everything? That was me. When your library was going to close due to budget cuts, and you organized that fundraiser, the anonymous donation that saved it, that was me. I never wanted anything from you, Grace. I just wanted to make sure the person who changed my life was taken care of. And when I learned about your divorce being filed, when my attorney informed me that you'd be alone and might need support, I couldn't stay away anymore. I had to make sure you were all right." Grace's mind was reeling. This was too much, too strange, too overwhelming. But underneath the confusion and shock, something else stirred. Something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Someone had seen her. Someone had valued her words, her existence, her impact, even when she'd forgotten her own worth. Over the next 3 days in the hospital, as Grace underwent tests for what turned out to be severe exhaustion, dangerously high blood pressure, and the early stages of stress-induced heart problems, William became a constant presence. Not overbearing, not demanding anything from her, just quietly there. He brought her books, real books, novels she'd mentioned wanting to read decades ago in book club meetings he apparently knew about through his investigators' reports. He brought her tea in the mornings, exactly how she liked it, with honey and a splash of milk. He sat in the chair by her window and worked on his laptop, giving her space but making sure she wasn't alone. And slowly, carefully, he told her the fuller story. The investigation had started innocently enough. William had simply wanted to know if the woman who'd changed his trajectory had found happiness. When he'd learned she'd given up writing, he'd felt a strange sense of grief, as if something precious had been lost to the world. He'd established the medical trust anonymously, routing it through so many legal channels that even Grace's insurance company didn't know where the supplemental funding originated. The library donation had come through a non-profit he'd established years earlier, one that supported community educational resources. Grace had never known. How could she have? She'd spent so many years looking down, staying small, trying not to be a burden, that she'd never thought to look up and see who might be looking back. Richard visited once during those 3 days. He showed up with flowers, cheap ones from the hospital gift shop, and an expression that was equal parts guilt and resentment. The younger woman, Jennifer, apparently wasn't quite as exciting once the affair became public knowledge. His co-workers weren't as accepting as he'd hoped. His daughter, who Grace had helped raise despite never having children of her own with Richard, wasn't speaking to him. Consequences, Richard was discovering, had a way of catching up. "Grace," he'd started, standing awkwardly at the foot of her bed. "I've been thinking. Maybe we were hasty. Maybe we could talk about reconciliation. Give it another try. We have history together." Grace had looked at him for a long moment. This man she'd spent more than half her life with. This man she'd loved so completely that she'd forgotten to love herself. And she'd felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness. Just a profound emptiness where her feelings for him used to be. "No, Richard." She'd said it simply, without drama. "We're done. We were done long before you filed those papers. You just finally admitted what we both knew." Richard's face had gone through several expressions: surprise, hurt pride, and finally, defensiveness. "This is about him, isn't it? That billionaire who's been hanging around. You barely know him, Grace. He's probably just interested in some midlife crisis fantasy. You're being naive." Grace had smiled then. A real smile. Perhaps the first genuine one she'd given Richard in years. "Maybe I am. Or maybe, for the first time in decades, I'm being smart enough to see when someone actually sees me. You should go, Richard. Take care of yourself. I hope you find what you're looking for." He'd left, and Grace hadn't seen him since. William had been out of the room during Richard's visit, giving them privacy. But when he'd returned and seen something lighter in Grace's expression, he'd simply nodded. You look relieved." She'd laughed softly. "I am. It's strange. I thought I'd feel sad or angry or something, but I just feel free." William had settled back into his chair, that gentle smile on his face. "Freedom looks good on you." They'd sat in comfortable silence for a while before Grace had finally asked the question that had been building in her mind. "Why now, William? Why step forward now, after all these years? You could have stayed anonymous. You could have just kept helping from the shadows. Why reveal yourself? Why call yourself my husband to the hospital staff? Why risk me thinking you're some kind of stalker or lunatic?" He'd been quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the parking lot below. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had been rough with emotion. "Because I'm 62 years old, Grace, and I've spent 40 of those years building companies, making money, achieving every external measure of success imaginable. But I've been lonely, profoundly lonely. Not because I don't have people around me. I have a daughter I adore, friends, colleagues, but lonely in the way you are when you know you haven't met the person you were meant to build a life with." William had turned to look at her then, and the vulnerability in his eyes had taken her breath away. "I've tried to move on. I married someone else, built a life, played the part I was supposed to play, but it never felt right. And when I found you again, even just through reports and photographs from an investigator, even just knowing you existed in the world, it felt like coming home. I didn't plan to ever tell you. I didn't plan to insert myself into your life. But when I got the call that you'd collapsed, that you were in the hospital, that you were alone, I couldn't stay away. I had to see you. I had to make sure you were okay. And maybe I hoped that if you survived, if you came through this, you might give me the chance to show you what it feels like to be truly valued, not as a wife who serves, but as a woman who matters." Grace had wiped tears from her eyes. "What if I can't? What if I'm too broken, too used up, too tired? What if I don't have anything left to give?" William had reached over and taken her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Then you rest. You heal. You take all the time you need. I'm not asking you to give me anything, Grace. I'm asking if you'll let me give something to you. Time, space, support, friendship, and maybe, eventually, if you want it, love. But only if you want it. Only when you're ready. No pressure, no expectations, just possibility." Those words, that promise, had cracked something open inside Grace that she'd thought was sealed forever. The part of her that could hope, the part of her that could dream, the part of her that still believed, despite everything, in second chances. She'd squeezed his hand back. "I'd like that. I'd like to see where possibility leads." William's smile had been brilliant, transforming his entire face. "Then that's what we'll do. One day at a time." Over the following weeks, as Grace recovered and returned to her small apartment, the one she'd moved into after the divorce, her life began to shift in ways both small and profound. William didn't move in. He didn't overwhelm her with grand gestures or expensive gifts. Instead, he showed up. He took her to bookstores and let her wander the aisles for hours. He invited her to quiet dinners, where they talked about everything and nothing. He introduced her to his daughter, Rachel, a 34-year-old architect who'd inherited her father's kindness and immediately welcomed Grace with warmth. He asked about her old manuscript, the novel she'd set aside all those years ago. When Grace admitted she'd thrown it away during one of Richard's cleaning purges, William had looked so genuinely sad that Grace had almost cried. "Then write a new one," he'd said simply. "You're not the same person you were at 23. You have new stories to tell now. Better ones. True ones." And Grace, tentatively at first, and then with growing confidence, started writing again. Not the idealistic romance she'd imagined in her youth, but something deeper. A story about a woman who loses herself in the process of loving someone else, and who finds herself again in the last place she expected to look. She wrote in the mornings, her fingers flying over the keyboard, words pouring out of her like a dam had finally broken. William read every chapter she sent him, and his feedback was thoughtful, encouraging, never condescending. He celebrated her victories, the day she finished a difficult scene, the moment she finally figured out her ending, and he held her through her doubts, the days she was convinced it was all garbage, and she should just give up. "You're brilliant," he'd tell her when the doubts came. "Your words matter. Keep going." 6 months after her collapse, Grace finished her manuscript. 8 months after that, she secured a literary agent. 10 months after that, she signed a publishing deal with a major house. The book wouldn't come out for another year, but Grace didn't care. She'd done it. She'd finally done the thing she'd dreamed of her entire life. And through it all, William was there, not as a savior or a rescuer, but as a partner. Someone who stood beside her, rather than in front of her or behind her. Someone who celebrated her success as if it were his own. Someone who, slowly and carefully, taught her what it felt like to be truly loved. Not because of what she could do for someone, not because of the role she played or the image she maintained, but simply because of who she was. Messy, imperfect, still healing, still learning, still discovering the woman she'd buried under years of being what others needed. Meanwhile, Richard's life had taken a dramatically different turn. The relationship with Jennifer had imploded within months of the divorce being finalized. Turns out, Jennifer had been attracted to the idea of Richard as a financially secure, established man who could provide stability. But Richard's finances weren't nearly as solid as he'd presented. He'd been living above his means for years, maintaining a lifestyle funded by credit cards and home equity loans. The divorce settlement, while not as generous to Grace as it should have been, had still required him to split assets and liquidate accounts he'd been counting on for retirement. Jennifer, realizing Richard wasn't the golden ticket she'd imagined, had moved on quickly. She'd started dating his former boss within weeks of their breakup. The humiliation Richard felt was compounded by the fact that everyone at his office knew about his affair, knew about his divorce, and now knew he'd been dumped for someone more successful. His professional reputation suffered. He wasn't fired, but he was passed over for a promotion he'd been counting on. Younger colleagues whispered and smirked when he walked past. His daughter, Christine, who'd been raised largely by Grace during the years Richard worked constantly and barely came home, had been devastated by the divorce. Not because she wanted her father and Grace to stay together if they were unhappy, but because of how he'd handled it. The affair, the cruelty, the way he'd discarded a woman who'd given him decades of loyalty and support. "You threw away the best thing in your life," Christine had told him during their last conversation. "Grace was always there for me. She came to every school play, every graduation, every hard moment. Where were you? Working. Always working. And now you've destroyed the one person who actually loved you unconditionally. And for what? Some woman who didn't even stick around?" Christine had stopped taking his calls after that. Richard tried to reach out, tried to explain, but she'd made it clear she needed space. Maybe someday she'd forgive him, but not now, not when the wound was still fresh. Richard found himself alone in a way he'd never experienced before. He'd always had someone, Grace managing the home front, handling the social calendar, making sure he had clean clothes and good meals and a comfortable life. He'd never appreciated how much invisible labor she'd done until he had to do it himself. His apartment was a mess. He ate takeout most nights and gained 15 pounds. He forgot to pay bills and got late fees. He showed up to a work event wearing mismatched socks and a wrinkled shirt because he'd never learned to iron properly. Small humiliations piled up. And then, about 8 months after the divorce, Richard saw the article. He was scrolling through his phone during a particularly boring Tuesday afternoon when a notification popped up from a news app. Tech mogul William Cross announces major donation to literacy programs. Credits author Grace Mitchell for inspiration. Richard had clicked on it, his heart sinking with a sick feeling of premonition. There was a photo. William Cross, looking distinguished and successful in an expensive suit, standing beside Grace. She looked transformed. She was wearing a simple but elegant dress, her hair styled in a way Richard had never seen, her smile genuine and bright. She looked radiant. She looked happy. She looked like a woman who'd finally stepped into her own light. The article detailed William's $50 million donation to literacy programs across the country, establishing writing workshops and funding aspiring authors from underserved communities. But what made Richard's hands shake was what William had said in the interview. This donation is inspired by someone extraordinary, a woman who believed in the power of words and second chances long before I understood either. Grace Mitchell taught me that everyone has a story worth telling, and that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. I'm honored to support her vision and thrilled to announce that her debut novel will be published next spring. It's a testament to resilience, to reinvention, and to the truth that our lives don't end just because one chapter closes. Sometimes the best parts of our story are still waiting to be written. Richard had read it 3 times, each time feeling more hollow. Grace was publishing a novel. Grace, who he'd dismissed as boring, as someone whose dreams didn't matter, was not only achieving those dreams, but being celebrated publicly by one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. The comments section under the article was full of people celebrating Grace's success and praising William's generosity. Several comments mentioned how inspiring it was to see someone pursue their passion later in life. One comment, which got hundreds of likes, simply said, "Lucky woman, finding a man who actually values and supports her dreams." That comment haunted Richard, because he knew, with crushing certainty, that Grace had found something with William that Richard had never given her. True partnership, genuine support, someone who saw her not as an accessory to his life but as the main character in her own story. Richard tried to reach out. He sent Grace an email, congratulating her on the book deal. She responded politely but distantly, "Thank you, Richard. I hope you're doing well." That was it. No opening for further conversation, no invitation to reconnect, just polite acknowledgement and a firm boundary. He tried calling once, but the number he had for her was disconnected. She'd changed it. Of course she had. Why would she want him to have access to her anymore? Richard's mother, who'd always adored Grace, made her disappointment abundantly clear during their weekly phone calls. "You let a treasure slip away because you were chasing fool's gold." That's what she'd said. "Your father did the same thing to me. And look where it got him. Alone and bitter until the day he died. You're following right in his footsteps." Richard wanted to argue, to defend himself. But what could he say? That he'd been unhappy? That he'd needed change? The truth was, he'd blown up his life, chasing the illusion of excitement, of passion, of something more, without ever recognizing that the problem wasn't his marriage. The problem was him. His inability to appreciate what he had, his constant restlessness, his belief that happiness was always somewhere else, with someone else, in some other circumstances. Now, watching Grace's success from afar, watching her bloom with someone who actually watered her roots, instead of cutting them down, Richard finally understood what he'd lost, and it was too late to get it back. Grace's transformation wasn't instantaneous or magical. Healing never is. There were days she doubted everything, days she wondered if she was making a mistake, if she was being foolish to trust William, if she was too damaged from her marriage to Richard to ever really be whole again. She started seeing a therapist, something she'd resisted for years because Richard had always dismissed therapy as self-indulgent nonsense. Dr. Patricia Lee was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach. She didn't let Grace wallow, but she also didn't rush her. In their sessions, Grace unpacked decades of conditioning, of making herself smaller, of equating her worth with how useful she was to others. Dr. Lee helped her see patterns she'd never recognized, how she'd learned as a child to be the peacemaker, the good girl who never caused trouble, how that had translated into a marriage where she'd absorbed Richard's moods, his criticisms, his emotional unavailability, and blamed herself for not being enough. "It was never about you not being enough, Doctor," Lee told her during one particularly difficult session. "It was about him not being capable of seeing what was right in front of him. Some people go through life, never learning how to truly value another person. That's his loss, Grace. His failure. Not yours." Those words settled into Grace's bones slowly, gradually replacing the old narrative she'd carried for so long. She started setting boundaries, small ones at first. She told William when she needed alone time, when the attention felt overwhelming, when she needed to process her feelings without someone trying to fix them. And William, bless him, respected every single boundary without making her feel guilty about it. "Thank you for telling me what you need," he'd say. "I'm here when you're ready. No pressure." Grace reconnected with old friends she'd lost touch with during her marriage, women from her book club and her library job who'd watched her shrink over the years and hadn't known how to help. They welcomed her back with open arms, throwing her a celebration dinner when her book deal was announced. One of them, Patricia, a retired teacher with silver hair and a sharp wit, pulled Grace aside during the party. "We're so proud of you, not just for the book, but for getting yourself back. We missed you, the real you, not the ghost you became." Grace had cried then, grateful tears, realizing just how much of herself she'd lost, and how much work it had taken to find her way back. Her writing became not just a creative outlet but a form of therapy. She poured everything into her novel, all the pain, the betrayal, the slow awakening to her own worth, the terrifying hope that maybe it wasn't too late to start over. Her protagonist was a woman named Helen, 56 years old, who discovers after her husband's death that he'd been leading a double life. As Helen unravels the secrets, she simultaneously discovers parts of herself she'd forgotten existed. The novel wasn't autobiographical exactly, but it was true in all the ways that mattered. It was a story about resilience, about the courage it takes to face uncomfortable truths, about learning that closure sometimes means opening a door you thought was permanently sealed. When Grace's editor read the complete manuscript, she'd called Grace personally. "This is extraordinary," she'd said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's raw and honest and real in a way that's going to resonate with so many people. Women especially, women who've spent their lives accommodating and adjusting and shrinking themselves to fit into spaces that were never designed for their full selves. This is going to help people. Grace, your story is going to matter." That conversation had been one of the proudest moments of Grace's life, not because of external validation, though that felt good too, but because she'd finally created something that came from the deepest, truest part of herself, something that couldn't be diminished or dismissed or tucked away in a drawer. Her relationship with William deepened gradually, organically. There was no dramatic moment where everything clicked into place. Instead, there were 1,000 small moments. The morning, he brought her coffee and a blueberry muffin, her favorite, because he'd remembered an offhand comment she'd made weeks earlier. The afternoon, they got caught in a rainstorm, and instead of rushing for shelter, they'd looked at each other and started laughing, spinning in circles like kids while rain poured down. The evening, she'd had a panic attack about her book launch, convinced no one would come and everyone would hate it, and he'd held her while she cried, and then gently reminded her that success wasn't measured by other people's opinions, but by whether she was proud of what she'd created. 10 months after her collapse, William asked her to take a trip with him. "Nothing fancy," he'd assured her. "Just a weekend at a cabin in the mountains. I want to show you something." Grace had been nervous, worried about implications, about expectations, but when they'd arrived at the cabin, she'd understood. It was simple, rustic, surrounded by pine trees and overlooking a lake that reflected the sky like glass. Inside, there was a desk positioned by a large window, perfectly situated to watch the sunrise. William had set his hand on the desk, almost shyly. "I bought this place 6 months ago. I've been fixing it up. I thought maybe you'd like to use it sometimes when you need quiet space to write. No obligations. You'd have complete privacy. I'd only come if you invited me. But I wanted you to have a place that's just yours, where no one can interrupt or disturb you, where you can create in peace." Grace had walked to the window, looking out at the stunning view, and felt something crack open in her chest. No one had ever given her space before. Not physical space, but the kind of space that honored her needs, her process, her independence. Richard had always resented when she closed a door to write, had always found reasons to interrupt, to pull her back to tasks he deemed more important. But William was offering her the opposite, a sanctuary. She'd turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "Why do you do this? Why are you so good to me?" William had crossed the room, cupping her face gently in his hands. "Because you deserve it. Because watching you become yourself again is the greatest privilege of my life. Because I love you, Grace. Not who I want you to be. Not some version of you that serves my needs. Just you, exactly as you are." It was the first time he'd said those words. Grace had kissed him then, pouring 38 years of waiting and longing and hope into that kiss, even though she hadn't known she was waiting. They'd made love that night in the cabin, slow and tender. Two people who'd lived full lives separately, finally coming together. Grace had felt seen in a way she'd never experienced. Vulnerable but safe, present in her own body in a way she hadn't been in decades. Afterward, lying in William's arms with moonlight streaming through the windows, she'd whispered, "I love you too," and meant it with every fiber of her being. The next morning, they'd sat on the cabin's porch drinking coffee and watching mist rise off the lake. Grace had felt peaceful in a way that had nothing to do with external circumstances and everything to do with internal alignment. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, with someone who valued her, pursuing dreams she'd thought were dead, living a life that finally felt like her own. William had broken the comfortable silence with a question. "What are you thinking about?" Grace had smiled. "I'm thinking about second chances, how rare they are, how precious. I'm thinking that I spent so many years believing my story was over, that the best parts of my life were behind me, and I was wrong. The best parts were just waiting for me to be ready for them." William had squeezed her hand. "Your younger self, the one I met outside that library. She told me that the best stories are about people who keep searching, even when the path isn't clear. You've lived that story, Grace. You never stopped searching, even when you didn't realize that's what you were doing." Grace had thought about that, about all the years she'd felt lost, stuck, invisible, about how even in her darkest moments, some small part of her had held onto hope, had kept journals, had scribbled story ideas on scraps of paper she'd hidden in drawers. Maybe William was right. Maybe she'd been searching all along, just waiting for the right moment to find herself. Over the following months, Grace split her time between her apartment, the cabin, and occasionally staying at William's home, a beautiful but not ostentatious house in a quiet neighborhood. His daughter, Rachel, became a genuine friend, someone Grace could talk to about the complexities of building a relationship later in life, someone who shared her father's kindness and welcomed Grace into their family without reservation. "You make him happy," Rachel told Grace one afternoon over tea. "I haven't seen him this genuinely content in years, maybe ever. Thank you for giving him a chance." Grace had been touched by that, realizing that this relationship wasn't just healing for her but for William too. He'd been lonely for so long, successful in every external way, but missing the kind of deep connection that makes life meaningful. They'd both been searching, it turned out. They'd both been waiting. And somehow, across decades, and despite impossible odds, they'd found each other again. Grace's book was published on a crisp October morning, exactly 2 years after her collapse at the courthouse. The launch party was held at a beautiful bookstore in the city, the kind of place Grace had always dreamed of having an event. The room was packed, standing room only, filled with friends, readers who'd gotten advance copies, and press covering what had become a feel-good story about a woman who'd reclaimed her voice. Patricia from the book club gave a speech that made Grace cry, talking about watching her friend disappear during her marriage and then witnessing her rebirth. William stood in the back, not seeking attention, just beaming with pride. And Grace, standing at the podium, looking out at all these faces, felt overwhelming gratitude. She read a passage from her book, one where her protagonist realizes that she'd spent so long being what others needed that she'd forgotten she was allowed to need things too, allowed to want things, allowed to take up space and make noise and demand better. When she finished reading, the applause was thunderous. During the Q&A that followed, someone asked her what she wanted readers to take away from the book. Grace had thought carefully before answering. I want people to know it's never too late. That's the message. It's never too late to start over, to pursue a dream you set aside, to leave a situation that's diminishing you, to open your heart again, even after it's been broken. Our lives don't follow neat timelines. We're allowed to bloom at 60 the same way we bloom at 20. We're allowed to say, "This isn't working anymore," and walk away. We're allowed to choose ourselves. And we're allowed to believe that good things can still happen, that love can still find us, that our best chapters might still be unwritten. The audience had erupted in applause again, and Grace had seen tears on many faces. After the event, dozens of people lined up to get their books signed, many sharing their own stories of late-life transformation, of divorces survived, of dreams resurrected, of hope rekindled. A woman in her early 70s told Grace she'd left her husband of 48 years after reading an advance copy of the book. "I realized I'd been making myself miserable trying to make him happy, and it was never going to work. Thank you for showing me it's not too late to choose myself." A man in his 60s, recently widowed, told Grace the book had helped him process his grief and reminded him that life still held possibility. These conversations, these connections, meant more to Grace than any bestseller list or critical review. She'd touched people's lives. She'd mattered. Within 2 months, the book climbed onto the bestseller lists. Within 4 months, a production company optioned it for a limited series. Grace's life transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined 3 years earlier when she'd been standing in that courthouse, signing away her marriage, feeling like her life was ending. Instead, her life had been beginning. The real life. The one she was meant to live. How would you have felt if someone told you 3 years ago that this would be your life? William asked her one evening as they sat by the fireplace in the cabin, snow falling softly outside. Grace had considered that question seriously. I wouldn't have believed them. I would have thought it was a cruel joke or impossible fantasy. I'd forgotten how to hope for anything beyond just getting through each day. William had pulled her closer. And now, Grace had smiled. The kind of smile that came from deep contentment, rather than temporary happiness. "Now, I understand that life isn't linear, that everything that happened, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts, brought me here, to this moment, to you, to myself. I wouldn't change any of it because it all led to this." William had kissed her forehead. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know. There's no pressure. No expectation. You can say no, and nothing changes between us." Grace's heart had started racing, intuition telling her what was coming. William had pulled back slightly, meeting her eyes. "Marry me. Not because you need someone to take care of you or because society says that's what people do. Marry me because we're partners, because we make each other better, because I want to spend whatever years I have left building a life with you. We can sign a prenup. We can keep separate finances. We can structure it however makes you comfortable. But I want to call you my wife for real this time, not just in a hospital emergency. I want to choose you every day for the rest of my life." Grace had felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they were happy tears, joyful tears, tears of someone who'd been given a gift they'd stopped believing existed. "Yes," she'd whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." They'd gotten married 6 months later in a simple ceremony at the cabin, just family and close friends. No big production, no stress, just 2 people making a commitment based on genuine love and respect. Rachel was William's best woman, and Patricia from the book club was Grace's maid of honor. They wrote their own vows. William had promised to always see her, to always value her voice, to always give her space to grow. Grace had promised to let herself be loved, to trust that she deserved happiness, to keep choosing courage even when it was scary. When the officiant pronounced them married, Grace had felt something settle into place in her soul. This was what partnership was supposed to feel like. Not losing yourself in someone else, but finding the best version of yourself, reflected in their eyes. Richard learned about Grace's marriage from Christine. His daughter had called him on a Sunday afternoon, her voice stiff and formal. "I thought you should know Grace got married yesterday. She's very happy. I was there. It was beautiful." Richard had felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Married? Already? It's only been, what, 2 years since our divorce? Christine's voice had turned cold. 2.5 years, Dad. And yes, already. Because when you find someone who actually values you, who sees you, who supports your dreams instead of dismissing them, you don't waste time. William is wonderful to her. He's everything you never were. That had stung more than Richard wanted to admit. Everything I never was? I provided for her for 35 years, Christine. I gave her a home, security, stability. Christine had laughed, a bitter sound. You gave her a prison, Dad. You gave her just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. And the worst part is, you never even noticed. You never saw her. You never appreciated what she sacrificed for you. And now she's with someone who does see her, who does appreciate her, and she's flourishing. Her book is a bestseller. She's being interviewed on major podcasts and morning shows. She's living the life she always dreamed of. And you? You're alone in a messy apartment, eating frozen dinners, bitter that the woman you discarded found happiness without you. Richard had wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat, because Christine was right. About all of it. After that conversation, Richard had done something he'd been avoiding. He'd bought Grace's book. He'd sat in his apartment, bourbon in hand, and read it cover to cover in one sitting, and with each page, he'd seen himself reflected in the worst possible light. The husband in the book wasn't named Richard, but it might as well have been. The small cruelties, the dismissiveness, the way he'd slowly eroded his wife's confidence through 1,000 tiny cuts. Never one thing dramatic enough to point to, but a death by 1,000 paper cuts, nonetheless. The protagonist's internal monologue had been devastating to read. She blamed herself constantly. She tried so hard to be what he needed. She twisted herself into smaller and smaller shapes, trying to fit into the space he'd allotted her. And none of it was ever enough, because he'd never valued her in the first place. Richard had seen himself in that husband character and felt sick. Is this really how she'd experienced their marriage? How had he been so blind? The book's turning point came when the protagonist, after discovering her husband's betrayal, had a moment of clarity. She realized she'd been complicit in her own diminishment. Not because the treatment was her fault, the book was very clear about that, but because she'd kept accepting crumbs and calling it love. She'd kept making excuses. She'd kept hoping he'd change instead of accepting that people show you who they are and believing them. The protagonist's journey toward reclaiming herself had been painful to read because Richard recognized every step was likely something Grace had experienced. The therapy sessions, where she unpacked years of conditioning. The moments of self-doubt where she questioned whether she deserved better. The slow, gradual awakening to her own worth. And then, the love story, in the final third of the book, the unexpected second-chance romance, with a man who valued her from the start, who supported her dreams, who gave her space to become herself. Richard had recognized William in that character too. The opposite of everything Richard had been. Patient, where Richard had been demanding. Supportive, where Richard had been dismissive. Present, where Richard had been absent. The book ended with the protagonist married to her second-chance love, publishing her first novel, standing on a stage, accepting an award. The final line had broken something in Richard. She looked out at the audience, at all these faces, at the man who'd waited years for her to be ready, and she realized the truth. You can't lose something you never truly had, but you can find something you never knew you needed. And sometimes the greatest love story isn't about finding someone new. It's about finding yourself, and then finding someone who loves that self completely. Richard had closed the book with shaking hands. He'd lost Grace long before the divorce. He'd lost her gradually, through neglect and dismissiveness, and taking her for granted. He'd treated her like furniture, something useful but unremarkable, something that would always be there, no matter how poorly he treated it. And now, she was gone. Not just divorced from him, but completely, entirely moved on, living a life so far beyond what they'd shared that he might as well be a footnote in her history. The ex-husband, who taught her what she didn't want, the cautionary tale, the before picture, in her transformation story. Over the next year, Richard watched from a distance as Grace's star continued to rise. Her book was adapted into a limited series starring a major actress. The series was a massive hit, praised for its honest portrayal of a woman's journey to self-discovery later in life. Grace did interviews where she spoke eloquently about second chances, about the courage it takes to start over, about learning to value yourself when the world has taught you to be small. She never mentioned Richard by name. She was far too classy for that. But anyone who knew their story could read between the lines. Richard's own life remained stagnant. He'd made lateral moves at work, but nothing significant. He'd dated occasionally, but nothing stuck. Women his age weren't interested in a man who was still bitter about his ex-wife's success. Younger women saw him as a cautionary tale, the kind of man their mothers warned them about. He'd tried to reconnect with Christine multiple times, but she maintained firm boundaries. She'd have lunch with him once every few months, but the warmth was gone. She was polite, cordial, but distant. Like he was an acquaintance she tolerated rather than the father she'd once adored. "I need you to understand something, Dad," she'd told him during one particularly tense lunch. "Grace raised me. You were there physically sometimes, but she was the one who showed up. She was at every school event, every doctor's appointment, every moment I needed a parent. You were building your career, chasing success, always somewhere else. And when you finally had the chance to appreciate what you had, you threw it away for someone half your age who didn't even stick around. That's on you. Those are choices you made. And until you actually take responsibility for those choices, instead of playing the victim, we're never going to have a real relationship again." Richard had tried to argue. "I've admitted I made mistakes. I've said I was wrong. What more do you want from me?" Christine had looked at him with something like pity. "I want you to actually mean it. I want you to show genuine remorse instead of just being sorry you got caught, sorry things didn't work out the way you wanted, sorry Grace is happy without you. I want you to do the work to become a better person, not just say the words you think I want to hear. Have you been to therapy? Have you actually examined why you treated Grace the way you did? Have you worked on yourself at all? Or are you just sitting in your apartment feeling sorry for yourself and waiting for someone to come along and fix it?" The truth was, Richard hadn't done any of that work. He'd been wallowing, not healing. He'd been resentful, not reflective. Christine's words had planted a seed, though. Maybe it was time to actually look at himself honestly instead of just blaming circumstances or bad timing or midlife crisis. He started seeing a therapist. Finally. A man named Dr. Marcus Chen, who didn't let him off easy. Dr. Chen made Richard examine his patterns, his beliefs about relationships, his tendency to blame others for his own dissatisfaction. It was uncomfortable work, painful work Richard had spent 63 years avoiding. In one session, Dr. Chen had asked him a question that stopped Richard cold. If you could go back and change one thing about your marriage to Grace, what would it be? Richard had started to answer with something superficial. "I wouldn't have had the affair. I would have been more attentive." But Dr. Chen had pressed him. "That's what you would do differently." I asked what you would change. What fundamental thing about how you approached that relationship would you alter? And Richard, sitting in that office with sunlight streaming through the windows, had finally faced an uncomfortable truth. I would change the fact that I never saw her as an equal partner. I saw her as support staff. As someone whose job was to make my life easier. I never considered her dreams as important as mine. I never thought about what she might need or want beyond basic security. I treated her like she was lucky to be with me, instead of recognizing that I was lucky to have her. That realization, that fundamental acknowledgement of his failure, was the beginning of actual change for Richard. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the damage he'd done. It certainly didn't bring Grace back, nor should it have. But it started him on a path toward becoming a better person, not for Grace or Christine or anyone else, for himself. Because carrying around all that bitterness and resentment and refusal to take responsibility was eating him alive. He started volunteering at a literacy center, inspired ironically by Grace's success and advocacy. He read to kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, helped adults prepare for their GED exams, donated money to programs that supported emerging writers. It wasn't redemption. He didn't do it for recognition or to somehow make amends to Grace from afar. He did it because it felt like doing something meaningful for once, instead of just taking up space and consuming resources. Christine noticed the changes. Slowly, cautiously, she started opening up to him again. Not all the way. Not with the trust and warmth they'd had when she was younger, but enough. Enough that they could have real conversations. Enough that she invited him to her gallery opening when she had a major showing of her architectural designs. Enough that when she got engaged, she told him in person rather than through a text. Richard attended Christine's wedding 2 years after Grace's. He sat in the back, not in the family section, earning that privilege back gradually. And he watched his daughter marry a kind man who looked at her the way William looked at Grace in all the photos Richard had seen. Like she was precious. Like she was valued. Like she was the most important person in the room. During the reception, Christine had come to find him. She'd been beautiful in her wedding dress, radiant with happiness. "Thank you for coming, Dad. It means a lot that you're here." Richard had hugged her, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. You chose well. He's a good man. I can see that." Christine had smiled, but there was sadness in it too. Grace and William couldn't make it. They're traveling in Europe, and the dates conflicted. But she sent a gift and a beautiful note. She always does that, you know. She still shows up for. Grace thought about Richard occasionally, hoped he'd found some measure of peace, but he belonged to a different lifetime now. She'd forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own, because carrying resentment was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. Her phone buzzed with a text from Christine. The baby fell asleep talking about Grandma Grace's stories. She wants you to write one just for her. No pressure. Love you. Grace's heart swelled. Grandma Grace. She'd never had biological children, but Christine had given her this gift, inclusion in her family, a role that mattered. She'd write that story. She'd write 100 stories. Because that's what she did now. She told stories that mattered, that healed, that reminded people of their own strength. "Ready for bed?" William asked, stifling a yawn. "In a minute. I just want to stand here a little longer and appreciate how beautiful life is when you finally stop settling for less than you deserve." William kissed her temple. "Take all the time you need. I'll be right inside when you're ready." And that, Grace thought as she watched him go, was the difference. A partner who gave her space, who didn't demand she rush or adjust or shrink herself to fit his schedule, who trusted her to know what she needed and honored those needs without question. Grace pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. An idea for her next book was forming, about a woman who thinks she's too old to chase her dreams until life forces her hand. She typed quickly, fingers flying. Sometimes the universe doesn't whisper. Sometimes it shouts. Sometimes it takes a collapse on courthouse steps and a stranger calling you, "my wife," to wake you up to the truth that you've been living someone else's life for so long you forgot what your own looked like. Perfect opening line. Grace saved the note and went inside to find William already asleep, book resting on his chest. She carefully removed his reading glasses, marked his page, and turned off the light. Then she climbed into bed beside him. This man who'd waited decades for her without even knowing if he'd ever see her again. This man who valued her not for what she could do for him but simply for who she was. Before sleep claimed her, Grace whispered into the darkness, "Thank you. Thank you to her younger self for having that conversation outside the library that changed someone's life. Thank you to her middle-aged self for surviving all those years even when surviving felt impossible. Thank you to the universe for second chances. Thank you to William for seeing her. And thank you to herself for finally choosing to be seen." So what do we take from Grace's story? Is it just a fairy tale? A fantasy where everything works out perfectly in the end? No. Because Grace's happiness didn't come from William rescuing her. It came from her choosing herself. From her doing the hard work of therapy and healing and learning to value her own voice. William was the reward. Yes, but not the solution. The solution was Grace, reclaiming her power, her dreams, her right to take up space in the world. How many of us are living like Grace did for those 35 years? Making ourselves smaller to accommodate someone else's ego? Setting aside our dreams because someone convinced us they don't matter? Staying in situations that slowly drain the life from us because we're afraid of being alone or starting over? Grace's story asks us a hard question. What would your life look like if you stopped settling? What dreams have you buried that are still trying to breathe? What version of yourself are you keeping locked away because someone told you she was too much, too loud, too ambitious, too old, too anything? It's never too late. That's not just a platitude. It's a truth Grace lived. She published her first book at 60, found real love at 58, started her healing journey at 59. Every year brought new growth, new possibilities, new versions of herself she hadn't known existed. And yes, she got her fairy tale ending, but she earned it, through courage and resilience, and refusing to believe the lie that her best years were behind her, through choosing herself even when it was terrifying, through opening her heart again, even after it had been broken. So I'll ask you what I asked at the beginning. What would you have done in her place? Would you have had the courage to walk away from 3 decades of marriage? Would you have trusted a stranger who claimed you'd changed his life? Would you have believed you deserved a second chance? And here's the harder question. What are you going to do now, today, in your own life? What small choice can you make toward valuing yourself more? What boundary can you set? What dream can you resurrect? What conversation can you have that you've been avoiding? Grace's story isn't just about her. It's about all of us. About the courage it takes to stop performing and start living. About the radical act of choosing yourself in a world that taught you to choose everyone else first. About believing that good things can still happen, that love can still find you, that your best chapters might still be waiting to be written. Where are you watching from? What part of Grace's story resonated most with you? Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever had to choose between staying comfortable and choosing yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's build a community of people who believe it's never too late, who support each other's growth, who refuse to accept that our stories end just because we reach a certain age. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it gave you even a spark of hope that change is possible, subscribe to this channel, because we tell stories like this, stories about real people facing real struggles and finding the courage to transform their lives. Stories that remind us we're not alone. Stories that matter. Grace collapsed on the courthouse steps, thinking her life was over. 8 years later, she stood on an awards stage living a life beyond anything she'd imagined possible. That's not fiction. That's what happens when you finally stop waiting for permission to live fully and start claiming the life you deserve. It's never too late. Your story isn't over. The best chapters might still be unwritten. Believe it.